In the first part of this reef build series, we went through all of the different equipment that came with this used, but new to me, beautiful, innovative Marine Fusion 20 Pro, what's gonna be a Nano reef aquarium right behind me. I got this tank from a local person in my area. It came with all sorts of extra goodies. It came with top-notch equipment. And since the last part, I've been going through all of that different equipment. I've been testing it out. I've been setting up all the apps for all of the different equipment, which is a new experience to me. Since I've taken a 10-year hiatus from the reef hobby. But nonetheless, I've gone through and I've made sure that all the pumps work. I've made sure that all the lights work. I've made sure that everything is in tip-top condition so that we were ready for this part, which is going to be adding saltwater to the Nuvo 20 behind me, flicking all the switches on, and bringing this thing to life. But before we actually get started on adding the saltwater to this aquarium, I want to do a quick little tour and just kind of show you everything a little closer up now that you can see it all in place. So this is our Gyre flow pump that we've got set up over here. There actually was another little wave maker pump that I think was set up over here somewhere originally, and I opted to remove that. I'm just going to test out and see what kind of flow I can get with just this one pump in here for now, but I've still got one for backup just in case we need a little bit more flow over here. Back in the back chamber of the all-in-one Nuvo 20 Fusion Pro, we've got right here our UV bulb. We're actually not going to turn this UV bulb on for a little while, and I'll explain that in just a minute. We're also not going to be using the skimmer for a little bit, but we've got the skimmer in the second compartment over here. A few people asked me what this thing was, and they thought it was some sort of another gyre pump. I guess it does sort of look similar to this thing right here, but this is actually a fan. So this fan is connected to this Inkbird temperature controller right here. And just like when the temperature of the water in this aquarium gets too low, it'll kick the heaters on, which are in this little back section right here. Just like how that temperature controller down there will kick the heaters on when the temperature gets too low, it will kick this cooling fan on when the temperature gets too high. It's going to blow air across the surface of the water, and that'll help me drop this tank back down to temperature. As you can kind of see in the room behind me here, I've got all sorts of lights and computers and heat and all sorts of things happening in here. So, there is a pretty good chance that I'm gonna have to need to use some, what do you call this type of method, evaporative cooling. Anyways, moving right along. We've got our little float switches over here for our auto top off and our auto water changer. We'll talk about those a little bit more towards the end of this video. And then right here on the right, we've got all of our dosing lines and everything like that. So again, those are coming down from the dosing pump and the little containers and all that stuff right now. This is how we're gonna dose our calcium and our alkalinity and our magnesium into the old tank when we need to. Before we start adding saltwater to this aquarium, before we start adding saltwater to this tank behind me, we need to discuss what's gonna be on the bottom of this tank. Now there's a couple different options that I could have gone with. The person that was running this tank before me was actually just running the bottom completely bare. So they just had plain glass. That's a pretty popular thing for people to do when they're growing corals and stuff like that, because the sand can get dirty and it can be sort of a nuisance. I personally don't really love the look. I want this thing to look as magnificent as I possibly can. And that's what I considered when I decided on what we were gonna put on the bottom of this tank. So let me show you what we got. I went with a black sand. I love the look of black sand. I love the look of a black background. I just love the look of colors of corals and things like that against black. I think it's gonna be the perfect foundation to our water garden back there. I don't want too much sand on the bottom here, maybe like an inch or so. I would say a little less than an inch. And I think at this point we've got, I would say about an inch or so. Now aquascaping this tank is going to be super simple. because I've basically got just one big old chunk. So I was debating pretty heavy on whether or not I was gonna chop this thing up, make little different islands in there, and I was kind of going through all of the different aquascaping ideas in my head. And would you believe it or not, after all of my deliberation, after all of my debate on all of the different options that we had and all of the different things we could do for the aquascaping in this tank, I went with the easiest approach. It actually presented itself right to me because all I had to do was flip this thing over and it became perfect. You'll see in just a second when I add it to the tank. Gotta be a little bit careful. Whoa. Let's do round two. I'll even say the same words again. You gotta be a little careful when you put this thing in because it's a bit of a tight squeeze. But if you wiggle her in just right, you can get it down in there. All right. And let's let that rest right on our black substrate bed there. So I think we're finally done talking about that though. I think it's finally time to move on to, this isn't gonna be the most exciting part of the video. We're gonna get to the most exciting part of the video after this one, but we are moving on to a monumental part of the video right now. So I've had a big old tub of about 25 gallons of salt water churning up for about a day or so now. I'm gonna get into how I actually made the salt water and all that stuff in just a second, but before we do that, it's gonna take a little bit, so let's get this into this. Abort. My pump's not strong enough to move the water from my bin to the tank, so I'm gonna have to go search the garage. I don't know, maybe in that big bucket of extra little parts and stuff I got that we saw in the first video for a pump that's strong enough to do this. I did manage to find this pump that we'll hook up in just a second to see if it works, but look what else I also managed to find while I was digging around out there. It's a freaking MP10. I've still got to get it cleaned up and find the power supply and see if it's working and all that, but this is actually a really good pump, so this actually might be something that, that we do use in that tank back there. Nonetheless, that's not what we're talking about. We're gonna try for round two. We're gonna see if this pump will help us out a little bit more. There we go. Squeeze it on. Success, it works. We've got a pump that actually is strong enough to do that. Now, obviously the most important thing in that tank back there, the lifeblood of the system is gonna be the water. It's what the fish swim around in. It's what delivers food to everything. It's what the corals are able to kind of flow around and do their thing in. Now, about a decade ago, before I had taken my hiatus out of reefing, I used what's called an RODI filter to create all of my water. What an RODI filter is, this is an RODI filter right here. This is a 4-stage RODI filter, so each stage of this is gonna just, without getting too sciencey, it's gonna do a little bit more and a little bit more purification until it finally comes up to this 4th stage, which is like a plastic membrane. This little sucker right here is gonna take every little last drop of anything nasty out of your water. I did the debates, I went through it. I know it's just a nano tank behind me. I thought, well, maybe I can get, RODI water from the fish store, or even just, already made salt water from the fish store. But I kind of like the nuance of creating my own salt water, and I like having water on hand all the time. So I thought, well, maybe it'd be easier if I could just get, distilled water or something like that from the grocery store. That was gonna end up being really expensive. And the conclusion I came to is that having one of these RODI filters is just an absolute must for any sort of reef tank, because now I can plug this thing whenever I want. I can always have water on hand. I can always have salt water ready to go in case of an emergency, in case I need to do a big water change or something like that. And it's just gonna end up costing a whole lot less in the end anyways. So that RODI filter was step 1 in creating the ultimate seawater. Step 2 was this stuff right here. I went with red sea salt just because this is what the setup that I purchased came with. You can go with any type of salt. I'm pretty sure they're all pretty dang good. They're gonna have instructions on the side. I'm personally going for a salinity of 1.026. It's the salinity that I used on my reef tank 10 years ago. It's the salinity that's suggested by the label for things like SPS corals and stuff that we know is gonna be in the tank. And you might be asking yourself, well, how do you know? How do you know what the salinity of your fresh salt water, now that you've got your RODI, now that you've got your salt mixed in, you followed the directions on the bucket, you've got your fresh bat of salt water, but how do you know when it's the right amount? The one thing that you do need to have if you want to make your own salt water in addition to your RODI filter right there, is one of these little gadgets. This right here is called a refractometer. You get a little pipette just like this, pop a couple drops right on there, take a little peek, and we're right at 1.026. It's also just fun to mess around with this stuff. Did I talk about that? Did I talk about how it's fun to decide what salinity level your water's gonna be at? Did I talk about how fun it is to test things out and to peer through your little refractometer here and mess with all the little numbers? That's why we get into reefing, right? Let's see how the tank's doing. The nice thing about a used setup is that there's usually a little water line that you can aim for. And there we go. The rest of this water I'll actually store away in some tubs that I have in the garage so that I have some nice fresh seawater ready to go if I ever need it. So it's always good to have a little too much than not enough, of course. But before we actually go any further and stop adding salt water to the tank back here, we got to turn on the return pump and all of that sort of stuff just to kind of get the blood flowing through the veins. We can also turn on some of the other things that we're going to need, like the temp. We're not going to turn the ATO on yet. We're not going to have the UV on at all for a while until this tank gets settled in. And we'll turn the flow on in just a little bit. We're also going to leave the skimmer off. So for now, we'll just go with the temp. And like I said before, the return pump. There we go. While we're at it, let's turn on that Gyre wave maker pump so we can sort of gauge the amount of flow that's going to be happening in this tank. Whoa. Maybe we'll cut those off for a second. Well, that was a little intense. Let's try that one more time. Okay, so it's still going crazy, but at least it's manageable now that it's further back. And we can get into our fancy app here. So fortunately, we can come in here and we can set the speed limit on this pump. Right now we have it set to 100%. I'm gonna knock this down to about, let's leave its max at about 40. I'm gonna upload my changes. Looks like it's doing something back there. But for now, not only do we have salt water in this tank, we've got all of the necessary equipment. We've got our vital equipment working and pumping that salt water all over the system in preparation for who knows what will come one day. Hold on, let me try and say that even more Neil deGrasse Tyson-ish. Neil deGrasse Tyson-ish. Did I say that right? Tyson-ish? Let me try and say that even more Neil deGrasse Tyson-ish.
And for now, the mystery remains. Don't forget to keep looking inward.
So I've got the temperature controller here set to 79 degrees. After much debate and much deliberation and much research online, I decided to go back to where I kept my reef tank 10 years ago. And 10 years ago, I always kept my tanks at 79 degrees. There's just something I like about that number, 79 degrees. 79 degrees. So the temperature controller is just silently doing its thing. There's one other piece of equipment that we want to get turned on, and it's for a very important reason, and I'll share that with you in just a minute. Before we get our auto top off turned on, the first thing I want to show you is these little doodads. So these are little magnet, little float levels that actually sit on the side of the tank here. And those things are going to tell this little auto top off machine here when the water level has dropped to a point that this thing needs to kick on and start putting some fresh water back into the system. If you didn't catch it at the beginning of the video, I've got my little auto top off container. It's a few gallons just sitting right over here. This is full of just plain RODI water, no salt water, no salt or anything in that. It's just a container of pure, fresh, untainted water ready to be topped off into this tank when the water level drops too much. If you remember from the first video, this auto aqua system does a whole lot more than just topping off your water. That's just one little sub feature of it. It also does automatic water changes, or has, fancy little buttons that I can press if I want to manually do a water change. I'm still formulating how I'm going to handle water changes, if I'm going to do water changes at all. But for right now, we're just going to use that fancy piece of equipment as an auto top off. And why an auto top off, you might be asking. You probably aren't asking that, but just in case you are asking why an auto top off, it's important to have an auto top off on any sort of a reef system, because as the water actually evaporates from this thing, as the water level drops, the salt that's actually in this water is going to remain in there. So the salinity level that we were talking about when I was talking about creating my own seawater, the salinity level is just going to keep rising and rising in the aquarium here. And of course, one of the main things that you want to avoid in any reef tank is just, drastic parameter swings, drastic changes in the salinity, drastic changes in the calcium and the alkalinity and all those things that we're going to be dosing into the water here. You want to keep things as stable as you possibly can. And by using an auto top off, not only will the water level in here be maintained, so it doesn't drop too low and look ugly, but it will also keep the salinity in the water at a nice consistent level. Let's mess with some of these floats and see if I can actually get this ATO to turn on automatically. The water will come out of this tube right over here. So let's drop this. Let's pull this completely out of the water. That doesn't do anything. And you can see it down in there pumping water in. It doesn't seem to be stopping. And I think this is going to be one of those situations where I have to turn the camera off, do a little bit of research, and come back with my newfound knowledge and pretend that it was just sitting in this noggin the whole time. I'll be back. Okay, so I figured it out. This big colored part on the sensors here is actually the part that's supposed to be in the water. I had initially had this flipped around and I had this part sitting on the outside of the tank, so it obviously wasn't, it didn't have any water to read. But right now, you can see we've got the ATO turned on. Right now it's not doing anything because the water level's perfect, but if we move this sensor up just a pinch, move it up with the magnet, you'll see over here that our auto top off is kicking on some fresh water. So now that we've got the auto top off working, that covers everything that we're actually going to be running on the tank for at least the time being. We've got the salt water in the tank, of course. We've got the return pumps working. We've got our Gyre wave maker pump creating flow in the tank. We've got that on. We've got the temperature controller with the heaters and the cooling fans blowing across the surface and all of that stuff running. And for now, until we actually put livestock in this tank, I'm just gonna leave these essential pieces of equipment running. We're gonna save things like the skimmer and the UV light and all of the stuff that basically does the filtration on this tank. We're gonna save all of that stuff. We're gonna save all of that stuff until we actually add our first livestock to the tank. And the reason that we're leaving things like the skimmer and the UV light off for right now is because we're about to add some of this Fritz Turbo Start 900 to the aquarium back there. Now, I've mentioned a few times in this series that this isn't my first hurrah in the reef keeping world. About 10 years ago, I had all sorts of tanks, and back in my day, the way that we started a tank, the way that we used to cycle a tank and start to get all of that beneficial bacteria, all of the things that are gonna be living in your water that eat all of the little nasties that your fish are gonna produce and all of that sort of stuff. The way that we used to kickstart that back in my day was by doing something like, either throwing just one really cheap fish into the thing so it could start pooping and doing all the stuff that it does. Or another method that I use quite a bit would be to throw like a raw shrimp in the water, let it start decomposing, let all of that nitrifying bacteria start to build up. But these days, 10 years later, we're doing it a little fancier. And this time I'm gonna use something called Fritz Turbo Start 900. One of the things that I've noticed about this Turbo Start stuff is that a lot of people will just dump this in their tank and then immediately start putting corals or fish or something like that in their water. I'm personally not going to do that, and it's not because I don't believe that you can. It's not because I believe that the label on this thing is lying and that we really shouldn't be adding any livestock or anything to the tank. I just happen to be going away on vacation for a week, so it's sort of going to work out perfect. We're going to cycle this thing the old school way without any livestock or any of that sort of stuff. It would actually probably be a really good idea to throw a couple fish in there so that they can start, creating waste and all of the stuff that the beneficial bacteria in this bottle is gonna consume. But I didn't want to pop a couple new fish in the tank and then have to go away for a week and not be able to watch them and do all that sort of thing. So again, we're gonna do it the old school way. We're gonna let this thing settle in for a week. We're gonna let this thing cycle. And then on the next part of this series, we're finally gonna get to the part that we've all been waiting for. So yes, on the next part, it's gonna be the most exciting part of all. We're gonna start to add that livestock. We're gonna start to add fish. We might even add some coral. We're gonna add what's called a cleanup crew. We're gonna talk about all this stuff as we're doing it. We're gonna dream about the future. We're gonna remember and appreciate the fact that we have these videos of this tank with nothing swimming around in it so that we get to document it right from the very beginning and watch this thing grow from a bare glass box back there into a beautiful underwater coral reef garden, whatever you want to call it. Did I mention why we're not going to turn the UV sterilizer and the skimmer and all that stuff on? That filtration equipment would eliminate pretty much all of the beneficial bacteria that I just poured into the tank, before it got a chance to start, reproducing and build its numbers up and all of that sort of stuff. We're going to give this a good shake. I'm going to switch you back over to a POV now.
And we'll let the bacteria take it from here.